Hello, everybody. Before I get started with these notes, I just wanted to say congratulations. You have now made it to our last set of notes for this entire class. Throughout this year, you have covered 99 different sections of topics. I hope that you have learned so much from our class from these notes. I'm just excited about everything that we have been able to cover, but mostly just I'm so proud of y'all for making it through all of these. So this is your last set of notes for AP Environmental Science. And today we're going to be covering 9.10, which is about human threats to biodiversity. The learning objective for today is that you can explain how human activities affect biodiversity and strategies to combat the problem. Some of the essential knowledge that you're going to get from today is the main factors that lead to a decrease in biodiversity, specifically focusing on some things like habitat fragmentation, climate change, human domestication, and then some strategies that we also have for mitigating this problem. So first, we are going to start with this really handy-dandy acronym that can help us to remember the main things that are going to be causing biodiversity loss. And that acronym is HIPPCO. Each of these stand for a different thing. So the H stands for habitat fragmentation or loss. This can occur from things like deforestation, wetland draining for like agriculture or urbanization, changing up things with our rivers when we have dams, kind of all those kind of things that are leading to either the dividing up and fragmentation of habitats or just the total loss of it. I is for invasive species, such as the zebra mussel or the kudzu vine, which we talked about a few notes ago. But invasive species are going to be able to outcompete native species for their food and space, which ultimately leads to lowering populations for those native species. The first P stands for population growth, specifically human population growth. This is going to drive habitat loss through our urbanization as we build up cities, our agricultural expansion to feed more people. And we're going to have to be creating a lot more habitat loss in order to take care of all of these growing numbers of people on planet Earth. Our second P is going to be pollutants. Notice the fact that I said pollutants, not pollution, because pollutants are like the actual things. Pollution is just like a term that doesn't really have any scientific substance to it. So specific pollutants, such as oil spills, which can reduce our biodiversity for like marine populations. We also have pesticides that are going to kill not only the species that they're trying to kill, but also our non-target species. So that's going to lead to a loss of biodiversity. Also, climate change. As climate change occurred, this is going to shift biomes, and therefore it's going to shift species habitat ranges. It can change the temperatures, the precipitation patterns, and this can all happen way too rapidly for species to migrate or to adapt through natural selection, which ultimately is going to cause population declines or even just total extinction of these species. And then our last one, the O, stands for overexploitation. So this is going to be when humans do things like excessive hunting or even poaching, like illegal hunting. And we are going to be hunting them at faster rates than their reproduction can recover, which is going to lead to population decline and, again, potential extinction. So we're going to first look at habitat fragmentation because this is kind of like a big one that happens from a lot of those different HIPPCO things that I just mentioned. And we're going to talk about like specific things that can cause it. So for example, when we build roads or pipelines to transport like natural gas or oil, these are going to cause fragmentation. You literally like run a road through a habitat and fragment it into two different habitats. You're going to have disrupting movement of organisms because now all of a sudden they have to be crossing things. They're getting blocked, especially if we have like really big highways that they can't really cross. And it's also going to lead to fatal collisions with vehicles. If you have ever seen roadkill on the side of the road, you've seen an example of how this habitat fragmentation has led to a loss of organisms. Now, this is a picture that kind of can show you the level of habitat fragmentation. This is going to be in northern Alberta in Canada. This is just in the past, like in a 50-year span, not even, like 42 years. And so in 1940, this is what it looked like. And we see some roads and then we see some urbanization. And then by the end of 1991, this is how fragmented that habitat's going to be. So this is kind of what we're talking about with habitat fragmentation. Clearly, all the organisms that were living in this area are now having to deal with this. We also are going to have our agricultural and urban land use. We're going to be clearing forests to make grasslands for agricultural fields. We are also going to just be building cities and houses and buildings, which is going to fragment those habitats. So if you look here, this originally was a forest, and now it has been created into a lot of agricultural land. And then we only have these little fragments of our forests left, which, if you imagine this used to be covered in forest land, that's quite a difference. And then also logging. This is going to be both the removal of trees, but also we have to build roads for all of these machines to get through and to transport the lumber. And that's going to lead to further habitat fragmentation. For example, this right here, if we're looking at the logging that occurred there, clearly that forest is being fragmented. Now, what happens with fragmentation is this is when we have it breaking up larger continuous habitats into smaller isolated patches. This is going to be disrupting the breeding, the hunting, and the migration of the species that live there. So now let's talk about something known as metapopulation. So I just talked about habitat fragmentation causing smaller isolated areas, which is going to lead to smaller isolated subpopulations. These smaller subpopulations are going to have less genetic diversity. They're going to be prone to inbreeding depression. They're going to have less resilience to environmental disturbances or disease. They're probably going to be crowded together, or they're going to die. And what this is going to end up causing is metapopulations. Now, metapopulations are still considered part of one population. They aren't a whole new species, but they're going to be these subpopulations that are connected by habitat corridors. So there's a little bit of gene flow that can happen, mating between these populations, that can help improve genetic diversity. So this is better than total isolation, but still not great. So for example, if you look here, on the right-hand side here, the left-hand side here is where you're going to have a good amount of movement. You have these corridors. The right-hand side here, we've got these tiny metapopulations. There's some flow that can happen, but not as much as we're seeing here when you have full-on corridors that they can travel through. Now, it's important to keep in mind that some species are more disrupted by fragmentation than others. Large predators that need lots of hunting space, they're going to have a harder time if they're being moved into these tiny little fragmented habitats. When we have smaller populations, especially if you're large case-selected mammals that need mates, they have parental care, they have smaller numbers, they're going to struggle to be finding mates. All right, now climate change. What are all the things that climate change can cause? First of all, it can cause temperature change. We are going to be getting warmer temperatures, which is going to shift biomes. Specifically, boreal forests and temperate coniferous forests are going to be shifting northwards. Tundras can also decrease. So if we look at these maps here, you can see the temperature change, vulnerability to biome change. Specifically on the top here, versus the bottom, this is historically where these biomes have been versus some of the prediction for 50 to 100 years from now. So on the top here, if we are looking at these kind of darker green areas, that's going to be our boreal forests and our temperate coniferous forests. If you look in 50 to 100 years, this is moving northwards. Also tundra, which we are seeing here in the white color, we have a lot less of it as it's warming because we're having all of that ice melting. It's no longer going to be a tundra with the frozen permafrost, and clearly for all of the animals that are relying on the tundra for their habitat, you're going to get some biodiversity loss. Also, we can get precipitation changes. So warming global temperatures is going to decrease precipitation in some areas, which is going to lead to soil desiccation where it's drying out and desertification. However, in some other areas, it's going to increase our precipitation, which can lead to things like flooding. And expanding of the tropical ecosystems, which if you do not thrive in a tropical ecosystem, it's not going to go well if tropical ecosystem is now taking over where your original habitat was. So either way, just all this changing of the biomes and the conditions that these organisms typically have needed to survive, it's going to lead to a loss of biodiversity there. We are also going to get sea levels rising from climate change. So estuary habitats where you have like salt marshes or mangroves, they're going to become fully submerged and they're going to have more salt water moving into them. So it's no longer going to be this estuary environment. It's basically going to be the ocean now. So we're going to be having flooding in these coastal ecosystems. You won't be able to have the buffering of the mangroves. You're also going to be losing the great biodiversity that occurs in salt marshes and mangroves. These are very important habitats. And so when the ocean water is just kind of coming and flooding it and taking it over, you're going to be losing that habitat. Climate change is ultimately going to be causing a shift in the range of habitats, which is going to increase or decrease organisms' ranges altogether. So that's just kind of the summary of all these different things here. So biodiversity and domestication is another aspect. So specifically, like as humans are domesticating, a lot of times we're looking at like agricultural uses. So crops, which is the domestication of plants essentially, fewer plant species are grown as selective breeding and genetically modified organisms we only want the ones with the highest yield. And so those are going to be the ones that we end up keeping. So GMO use and selective breeding also leads to less genetic diversity in crops, which makes them even more vulnerable to disease or environmental disruptions. We've talked about potato blight as an example a few times this year. So kind of think like that. Now, if we look at like a century ago, all the different species that we had of like lettuce, peas, radishes, squash, stuff like that, versus 80 years later, this is the amount of genetic diversity that we have. Like we went from hundreds of different species to like dozens of different species. And so we are losing a lot of our plant diversity as we are domesticating it for our consumption. And then also livestock. Historically, there have been over 8,000 breeds of the 11 species most commonly eaten by humans. Think like chickens, cows, stuff like that. And many of these breeds were uniquely adapted to their local climates. Now, many of these breeds have now gone extinct, or they're at risk of extinction because of the fact that we're only selecting and breeding the ones that give us the most amount of meat. So again, if you look at this diagram here, this is kind of showing the number of species historically, the amount that's extinct, at risk, or we don't quite know where they're at. Again, we had 8,000, so some of these, like, we're looking at records of where they were, what happened to them, all of that. So either way, though, we are seeing a decrease in our biodiversity from this. So overall, our summary sentence is that the domestication of species for agriculture generally decreases genetic and species biodiversity. So how is it that we can mitigate biodiversity loss? One of the first things we can do is we can protect and connect habitats. So we can create national parks, nature preserves to prevent them from being developed so that they're areas that are just set aside to naturally be as they are. We can also connect fragmented habitats with things like wildlife corridors, which enable movement and breeding. So for example, this is going to be like a wildlife corridor that was built over a major highway so that the organisms and animals can just go over it. Fun fact, we have one of these here in Washington. If you ever drive over at the I-90 pass to get from Western Washington to Eastern Washington through the Cascades, there's a point about halfway through the pass where you have this massive, like it looks like you're driving through this like arched thing. And that's actually going to be a wildlife corridor, which I was so excited when they put it in. We've only had it for like the past few years, but they specifically made this so that animals can move across the major I-90 highway and get to the local lake there so that we can be protecting these species. So that's an example of something that we can do. And yay for Washington for doing it. We can also use sustainable land use, like urban growth boundaries or building up instead of out to reduce our urban sprawl to preserve existing habitats. We can also expand our parks and urban gardens and green roofs, and we can provide habitat for many species. We can also have more sustainable agriculture. We can lower our meat consumption so that we don't need as many of our CAFOs and things like that. That's going to reduce the agricultural land that we need, and it's going to prevent further habitat loss. So even the choices that you are making with like the food that you eat can help with mitigating biodiversity. And then also we can restore lost habitat. We can replant clear-cut forests. And we can reestablish prairies on old agricultural fields or golf fields, or think about what we've talked about with like restoring old mining areas. So restoring some of the things that we previously have decimated in the past. So this is going to be your practice FRQ for 9.10. You're going to practice the suggested skill of describing advantages, disadvantages, or unintended consequences for potential solutions. So I want you to describe one economic disadvantage and one economic advantage of preserving a piece of land as a wildlife preserve. So that's going to be your practice FRQ for 9.10. Those are your notes on 9.10. Congratulations on making it through all of them.